What if I told you that over the last century, the absolute safest, most highly recommended retirement strategy, like
Uh,
the classic portfolio meant to protect your entire life savings, actually had a historically proven chance of going straight to zero during certain windows of time?
yeah, and not just taking a dip, but being completely wiped out.
Exactly.
It's a well, it's a terrifying reality when you actually look at the numbers, because we are raised to believe in this sort of um, permanent financial stability.
Oh, for sure.
We just assume that the rules of the game today will be the rules of the game tomorrow.
But the data paints a very different picture. So today we are going on a massive deep dive into the mechanics of history.
We really are.
We're looking at a sweeping, incredibly data-rich visual history of global power, economics, and, well, human survival. We have a stack of charts spanning over 500 years of data.
All pulled from Ray Dalio's principles for dealing with the changing world order.
Yeah.
And it is a phenomenal collection of information. I mean, we are tracking everything from the rise of the Dutch Empire in the 1500s all the way to modern global markets.
Right, and the goal here is to map out the exact metrics of why superpowers rise, why they inevitably fall, and crucially,
What happens to your money when the cycle turns?
exactly. Think of this deep dive as a decoder ring for the modern world. We aren't just recounting dates and battles here. We want to understand the hidden gears turning behind the scenes.
Yeah, the real mechanics.
Okay, let's unpack this, because to understand how empires rise and fall, we first have to look at the massive, sweeping baseline of human existence over the last 5 centuries,
Definitely. And the best place to start is the global real GDP per capita chart.
which is just wild to look at.
It really is. That chart tracks the average economic output per person from the year 1500 all the way to the year 2000. And for centuries, I mean, 1500, 1600, 1700, the line is practically flat.
Yeah, humanity is essentially bumping along at the bottom of the graph. Generations lived and died with almost no change in their overall wealth or, technological capacity.
Right. It's like a patient flatlining on an EKG.
Oh, that's a great way to put it.
Just a total flatline.
And then the Industrial Revolution hits the chest like a defibrillator, and the graph just skyrockets upward like a hockey stick.
Suddenly, global wealth is just exploding.
But looking closely at that flat line, there's this fascinating little ripple in the 1600s right before the massive spike.
Yes.
It marks the invention of capitalism, specifically the founding of the Amsterdam Stock Exchange.
Right, because the Dutch recognized a fundamental barrier to growth. Funding massive, highly dangerous global trade voyages was just too risky for any single merchant.
Yeah, if a ship sank, you were entirely ruined.
Exactly. So they created a mechanism to pool capital and share risk. You could buy a tiny fraction of a voyage.
So if the ship sank, you only lost a little.
Right. But if it returned full of spices, you shared in the massive profits.
That one mechanism, fractional ownership, completely changed the math of human ambition.
It really did.
You didn't have to be a king to fund an expedition anymore. It allowed society to pool enough resources to build massive physical infrastructure, which essentially built the launchpad for the Industrial Revolution that followed.
It unlocked global trade on a scale never seen before.
Bruh.
And this is but that explosion of wealth introduces a paradox when you look at the human survival metrics in the accompanying charts.
Yes, this is exactly what I was struggling with when reviewing the sources.
Right.
If our GDP, our wealth, and our global life expectancy have all exploded so dramatically upward thanks to these financial innovations, why does the historical data show such intense recurring periods of global instability?
It's a crucial question.
Because looking at the global deaths by category chart, the spikes of mass mortality are huge.
The visual of those mortality spikes is completely sobering. You see massive blue spikes for conflicts like the 30 Years' War in the 1600s, the Napoleonic Wars, and the absolute devastations of the World Wars.
And the green spikes for pandemics are just towering.
Towering.
The 1557 influenza, the Third Plague pandemic, the Spanish flu killing tens of millions right at the end of the First World War, all the way up to COVID-19.
And layered in there are the gray spikes, too.
Right, marking massive famines in India and China. So the chart of our wealth is going straight up, but the chart of our survival is spiking wildly all over the place.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, macro progress does not prevent micro volatility.
Okay.
In fact, they are deeply interconnected. The same technological and economic booms that cause that wealth to skyrocket also create the conditions for massive, sprawling empires.
Ah.
And those empires will inevitably battle both internally among their own citizens and externally with rival nations for control of that newly created wealth.
Wow. So the wealth itself becomes the catalyst for the conflict.
Exactly.
If creating an empire is what ultimately leads to these massive clashes, we really need to understand the anatomy of how these powers built in the first place.
Right. And Dalio charts this out in what he calls the archetypical rise and decline.
Okay.
It tracks 8 key determinants of power. And the data shows they don't peak all at once. There's a very deliberate sequence to how a country rises to the top of the global order.
You know, my initial assumption, just thinking about history, was that the military would be the first thing to peak.
A lot of people think that.
Yeah, like you build an army, you conquer your neighbors, and boom, you have an empire.
That is a very common misconception. While brief military conquests happen, they don't build multi-generational global empires. The data shows the very first determinant to rise, long before the military or the financial centers, is always education.
Oh, wow. So you have to build the intellectual foundation first.
Without exception. A strong educational system trains the population to think critically and solve problems, which leads directly to the second determinant, innovation and technology.
Makes sense. You educate the population, they start inventing better ships, better manufacturing techniques, better medicine.
That's it.
And that naturally boosts the third determinant, which is competitiveness. You're suddenly producing goods more efficiently and cheaply than any other country on Earth.
And only then, once your economic engine is humming and you have valuable goods to protect, do you see the massive expansion in the next 2 determinants.
Which are?
A dominant military and expansive global trade. You use the military to secure the trade routes that your innovation made possible.
Which leads to the absolute peak of the mountain. Your economic output explodes, and you establish a strong financial center. You essentially become the banker for the rest of the world.
Right. And the culmination of all this is the 8th and final determinant, the ultimate prize of global dominance reserve currency status.
Right.
Your nation's money becomes the default currency that every other country uses to conduct international business.
I was trying to visualize this timeline, and the analogy that popped into my head was an elite athlete's career arc.
Oh, I like that.
Education is like the grueling, unseen training they do in their youth. Nobody's watching, but it's building the foundation. Innovation and competitiveness are when they hit the minor leagues, right?
Yeah.
Developing their unique skills and getting faster than everyone else.
And then the military and trade expansion would be their physical prime. They are dominating on the field, outmuscling the competition and securing massive victories.
Exactly. And establishing that financial center is the championship peak. They're winning rings, signing the biggest contracts in the league.
Yes.
But then comes reserve currency status. And to me, that's like an athlete relying on past reputation and massive brand endorsement deals long after their physical competitiveness has actually faded.
That's a perfect way to put it.
Their knees are shot, they aren't practicing as hard, but they're still on the Wheaties box because of what they accomplished 10 years ago.
The brand equity outlasts the physical dominance. We see this perfectly illustrated in the data for the Dutch Empire from about 1550 to 1850.
Yeah.
They followed this 8-step playbook to the letter. Their world-class education led to innovation in shipbuilding. That led to the creation of the first global corporation, the Dutch East India Company, which absolutely dominated global trade.
And because of that massive economic output, their money, the guilder, became the world's reserve currency.
But as they enjoyed that peak, their fundamental competitiveness began to rot. They became comfortable. They outsourced their labor, their debt increased, and rival nations like the British started innovating past them.
The athletes' knees started to go.
Exactly. Yet the guilder remained the global reserve currency for decades after the Dutch had fundamentally lost their edge.
Wow.
Eventually, reality caught up. The decline culminated in the Fourth Anglo-Dutch War, a loss of their trade monopoly, and a literal run on the Bank of Amsterdam. Their reserve currency status vanished, completing the cycle.
But do these determinants always happen in this exact order, or can an empire skip a few steps on the way to the top?
Variations do exist, but the foundational necessity of education and innovation driving the rest of the cycle is a remarkably consistent historical pattern across hundreds of years.
Here's where it gets really interesting, though. If the formula for building an empire is this consistent, and holding on to that wealth is so lucrative, why can't anyone just maintain the peak?
That brings us to the pressure cooker of internal disorder. The seeds of an empire's destruction are almost always planted during its absolute golden age. The sources map this out through the 6 stages of the internal order cycle.
Instead of just listing the stages, let's look at the human psychology driving them, because it reads like a multi-generational tragedy.
It really does. What's fascinating here is the generational shift. Think about the generation that comes to power after a major conflict.
Okay.
They rebuild society. They are frugal, they work incredibly hard, and they create tight, efficient systems to allocate resources. This discipline builds a massive economic boom, leading to a golden age of peace and prosperity.
But then their grandchildren inherit that system.
Yes.
They grow up entirely inside that golden age. They take the wealth completely for granted because they never saw the struggle required to build it. They're used to a high level of consumption, so when the fundamental economic output starts to slow down, they don't tighten their belts. They just start borrowing heavily to maintain their lifestyle.
And that generational shift is the fatal turning point. It triggers an era of massive excesses. And because those at the very top have the best access to this new credit and financial leverage, the wealth gap widens dramatically.
Yeah.
You end up with a society where a tiny elite is incredibly wealthy, while the working class is struggling just to pay for basic necessities.
The pressure cooker is turned on. The wealth gap provides the heat. And then we hit bad financial conditions, maybe a debt crisis or an economic shock.
Right.
That seals the lid tight. People are angry, factions form, and the population starts viewing the system itself as fundamentally rigged.
Without a release valve, the pressure inevitably blows. The system collapses into civil wars or revolutions, tearing down the old order entirely, and the cycle resets back to the beginning.
The sources actually put hard math to this pressure cooker, which is staggering.
It's sobering data.
Yeah, the data provides a quantitative scoring of these measures: debt burdens, wealth gaps, political polarization. Historically, when over 80% of a country's economic measures fall below a certain healthy threshold, the likelihood of internal conflict in the next 5 years leaps to 30%.
That is nearly triple the baseline risk. When the metrics are that bad across the board, the statistical probability of the lid blowing off skyrockets.
Wow.
And we see this exact generational cycle play out across completely different cultures and eras. The charts map this timeline through major Chinese dynasties: the Tang, the Song, the Ming, the Qing. You see the exact same rise, the same widening of wealth gaps, and the same revolutionary collapse.
But I have to challenge this idea that a collapse is mathematically inescapable. I mean, if an empire's leadership looks at the data, sees they have massive wealth gaps, and realizes they're sliding toward intense conflict, can they actively depressurize the cooker?
It's a good question.
Like, can they just choose to reverse course and go back to the golden age?
Reversing course is incredibly rare because it requires those in power to act against their own immediate self-interest.
Right.
To depressurize the system, you have to fundamentally restructure the debt and redistribute the wealth. You have to tell the elites, we are taking a significant portion of your capital to stabilize the working class and pay down the national debt.
And historically, elites do not surrender their wealth or power voluntarily.
Exactly. They fight to maintain their position, which only increases the polarization until the system breaks.
Okay, so when that break happens, when the pressure cooker blows and the cycle turns, who actually pays for the mess?
Well,
Because we're moving from high-level political theory to the hard, visceral financial reality of the citizens living through these charts.
to understand the impact on everyday wealth, we have to look at the big cycle of money. The sources categorize money into 3 historical types. Type 1 is hard money. Think physical metal, gold, or silver coins. It maximizes credibility because the coin itself has intrinsic value. But it severely limits credit. You cannot lend out more silver than you physically possess in the vault.
And it's pretty hard to fund a massive global empire if you have to wait to dig more silver out of the ground to pay your soldiers.
Exactly, which forces societies to evolve to Type 2. Claims on hard money. These are paper banknotes that represent a specific amount of gold sitting in a bank.
Right?
This is a massive leap forward because it expands credit, allowing for faster economic growth,
Yeah.
but it introduces a vulnerability.
Because the bank realizes that not everyone is going to ask for their gold at the exact same time.
Yep.
So they start printing more paper notes and they actually have gold to back up.
Which works perfectly, right up until there is a crisis and everyone runs to the bank to demand their gold. The system breaks.
Yeah.
And that leads inevitably to Type 3, fiat money.
Which is what we have now.
This is what the entire global economy uses today. It is paper money backed by absolutely nothing but the government's promise that it has value.
Fiat money maximizes credit. I mean, a government can literally type zeros into a computer to fund wars, bail out banks, or send stimulus checks. But it completely sacrifices credibility.
Right. When an empire is heavily in debt and facing intense internal conflict, the leadership faces a dilemma. They can't raise direct taxes to pay their debts because the population is already angry and might revolt.
Right.
So they choose the invisible tax. They print more fiat money.
And by flooding the system with new currency, they devalue all the existing currency. The money in the citizen's pocket simply buys less than it did the day before.
We need to decode some of the technical terms the sources use here because the reality is harsh. The charts track what they call spot effects against gold.
Okay.
That simply means they are measuring the exchange rate of various paper currencies directly against the physical value of gold over centuries. And the trend line for every single reserve currency in history is a massive drop.
Wow.
They all eventually lose their value against hard assets.
You see these massive drops during crisis points. The U.S. Civil War, the devastating German hyperinflation of the 1920s, the end of the Bretton Woods system in the 1970s.
The destruction of wealth goes beyond just inflation, too. The data on wartime asset controls is grim. During major conflicts, governments frequently enact what is called debt repudiation.
Which is a very polite term.
Yes. That is a polite financial term for a government simply declaring, we are not going to pay back the money we borrowed from you.
Or they just changed the rules of the market entirely. The charts show how during World War II, financial markets were simply closed by decree in places like Germany and Japan.
Yeah.
You couldn't sell your stocks, even if you saw the crash coming. And even after the war, in 1948, Germany restructured its currency entirely, which effectively wiped out the paper wealth of anyone holding the old money.
This brings us back to that terrifying question you opened the deep dive with. The charts track the worst 20-year windows for investors across major countries, focusing specifically on drawdowns. A drawdown is just the percentage drop in your portfolio from its peak to its lowest point.
And they specifically tracked a standard 60-40 portfolio that's 60% invested in stocks, 40% in bonds. It's universally touted as the safe, diversified way to protect your retirement.
And yet when we look at the real return, which is the actual purchasing power of that portfolio after factoring in inflation, the historical losses during these cycle shifts are catastrophic.
Over a 20-year window, investors in Russia from 1900 to 1918 saw a 100% loss of real return. Everything they had was gone due to the revolution and the collapse of the currency.
Yeah.
China from 1930 to 1950, a 100% loss. Germany from 1903 to 1923, suffering through the First World War and the Weimar hyperinflation, another 100% wipeout.
Unbelievable.
Even supposedly stable nations like France and Italy saw their citizens lose 70 to 90% of their purchasing power during these turbulent windows.
So what does this all mean? This raises an important question. If history shows us that fiat cash continually loses value and that traditional safe stock and bond portfolios can be entirely decimated by regime changes and inflation, how does a modern individual actually protect their purchasing power?
The data provides a surprisingly clear answer, but it requires a fundamental shift in how we think about investing. History rewards those who recognize the cycle early.
When you look at the charts comparing the real returns of government bills versus physical gold, a glaring pattern emerges. During those massive 60-40 drawdowns, when the stock and bond markets are collapsing because the pressure cooker has blown tangible assets, or shifting to rising inflation assets become crucial building blocks of a diversified portfolio.
The chart literally shows the returns on gold spiking upward at the exact historical moments that traditional paper portfolios are crashing.
The underlying lesson here isn't to panic and bury gold in your backyard.
Right, right.
The lesson is that the building blocks of a diversified portfolio must shift depending on where you are in the big cycle. When a society is in that golden age, when debt is low and peace is high equities and traditional growth stocks thrive, the 60-40 portfolio works beautifully.
But as you transition into the later stages of the cycle when wealth gaps are widening, political polarization is tearing the country apart, and the government is printing massive amounts of money to cover its debts. Holding a standard paper portfolio is historically dangerous.
Very dangerous.
Shifting towards tangible assets or investments that inherently rise with inflation becomes a critical strategy for financial survival. You cannot blindly apply the investment rules of a golden age to an era of internal disorder.
Absolutely.
Okay, let's take a breath and zoom back out because we have covered a massive amount of historical ground today. We started by looking at the economic flatline of the 1500s and explored how the mechanism of pooling risk launched the modern era.
We charted the 8-step playbook of how empires rise on the absolute foundation of education and innovation, and how they eventually cling to the brand equity of reserve currency status long after their true dominance has faded.
We looked into the terrifying multi-generational pressure cooker of internal disorder, where wealth gaps and unpayable debt predictably turn a golden age into a revolution. And finally, we saw the brutal mathematical reality of what happens to fiat currency and traditional investments when that pressure cooker finally blows.
It is a staggering amount of data, but it all connects to paint a singular, cohesive picture of human behavior.
And this is exactly why you, the listener, should care about all of this. Because you aren't just studying a history book right now, you are living inside this big cycle right now.
Yes, you are.
Whether you are prepping for a boardroom meeting, analyzing global markets, or just managing your own savings, understanding where your country sits on this historical timeline is the ultimate advantage. It's the difference between being entirely blindsided by an economic earthquake and simply reading the mechanics of the ticking clock.
Which leaves us with one final, incredibly important thing to consider. We have spent this entire deep dive looking at the past. But the sources define exactly what the 18 stages of an empire's rise and decline look like.
Yeah.
The warning signs are clearly labeled.
The widening wealth gaps, the state of infrastructure, the intense political polarization, the massive unpayable debt levels.
Look at the news today. Based strictly on Ray Dalio's metrics we just discussed, what stage do you think your society is in right now? And are you financially and mentally prepared for the next stage on the chart?
Now that is a thought that will definitely keep you up at night. Thank you all for joining us on this deep dive into the mechanics of history. Keep looking for the patterns, and we will catch you on the next one.